and we welcome you into this webinar on topic 4, Design for Online and Blended Learning. The agenda for today, we obviously have our guest in, and I'll introduce you to him in a moment, but really is an opportunity to hear what our guest has to share with us on this topic. Please do feel free, if there are any questions that you have, that you table those in the chat, and Lars Ullin will pick up and moderate the chat, and obviously will be to Martin. Martin Weller is a professor of educational technology at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University in the UK. He is currently the chair of the Open program, which is the Open University's flexible multidisciplinary degree, which is the largest undergraduate degree in the UK. Martin he developed the OU's first fully online course back in 1999, and it was one that attracted over 15,000 students annually. So certainly has a wealth of experience and insights to share with us in that regard. He was the director of the OU Learning Design program and has developed a range of innovative courses at an undergraduate and postgraduate level, as well as MOOCs. He is, of course, the author of a number of publications, not least of which is The Battle for Open, The Digital Scholar, and 25 Years of EdTech. Martin maintains a very popular blog at EdTechie, and I know when I first came across Martin was in his Twitter post some years back, when in fact I visited the Open University. It was a real privilege. So Martin, we're delighted to have you in the room today. And I know that our colleagues on the Open Network Learning course are keen to engage with you on learning design. So Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Shall I share my screen now? There we are. So hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. Is everyone seeing that presentation? Am I muted? I'm muted. Good. Okay. Thumbs up. Okay. Good. Hi, everyone. So I thought before we kick off, let's do some socialization in these strange times. So in the oh, hello to the cat joining the meeting. My dog's just left actually, so I can't introduce my dog to your cat. In the chat, come in and say where you're coming in from and how many different meetings are you in today? So it's your fourth meeting today.
Hard to keep track.
9 meetings. It's like a game of top trumps, isn't it? Who can do the most? And I think one of the so 5, 2 to go. Wow, that's impressive already. Yeah. First, not bad. First meeting today. That's good. I've already done 2. This is my 3rd today. I think one of the interesting things I was speaking to today is about the kind of cognitive shift we have to engage in now, which is quite different. So I was just in a meeting with my research group. I'm now giving a presentation to this group now online, and after this I go straight into a budget meeting group. And previously, when you had travel involved, you would be getting into keynote mode as you traveled to a place on the train or whatever. And I think we kind of do this kind of cognitive jumping quite a lot at the moment. And I think it's just generally interesting me, but I think one of the things that gets to is partly coming onto this talk about how we need to think about the context within which people are learning now and operating if they're learning online. They're not just in one physical location doing the thing that we've set up for them. They might be jumping around doing different things and going straight from your online lecture to a meeting or something, or doing something else. And I think what that demonstrates is that the kind of diversity that often our students operating in is similar to our own sort of complexity and diversity. So anyway, good. Thanks for that. Thanks for joining into that. So welcome and thank you for having me here. So I'm going to talk about why we developed learning design at the Open University. And just so, I don't know if you're all aware of the Open University, but the Open University in the UK is a purely distance education university. So it was set up in 1969. And there's mainly part-time study, although increasingly more full-time people. And the whole aim of it was to kind of bring in, it was called the University of the Second Chance, to bring in people into education who couldn't previously have studied. So we've always been distance education, let's say largely part-time, and we don't have any entry requirements, so you don't have to have studied at high school or got A-levels or whatever it is to come and study with us. So we're open in a number of ways. And so in some ways when the pandemic hit, I won't say it was business as usual for us because there was kind of huge upheaval for our students and for a lot of our admin staff who work on the site. But in general, the Open University could sort of carry on as it was because it wasn't based on bringing people to a physical location usually. And so lots of people came to us and were saying like, we're now having to do this online learning thing. Can you help us? So, and one of the ways we respond to that was what you need is learning design. So I'll come on to that at the end, I think, the kind of relationship of learning design to the pandemic and what we call the online pivot. But just to appreciate that the Open University may well be different from the context of which a lot of you are working in. And then I want to talk about some of the benefits of learning design, the approach we took for it at the Open University, which may not be, again, because of the way we operate, it may not be all applicable to what everyone does elsewhere, but I think there are bits of it we can take, and the tools we developed, which are available. And then I'm going to go into some quite specific examples of how we've applied it at the university, and just leave you with some tools to try. And then I thought at the end we could hopefully have some discussion. So that's what I'm hoping to do today. So what is learning design? So JISC, the UK government-run agency in the UK, said it defined it as the practice of planning, sequencing, and managing learning activities, usually using ICT-based tools to support both design and delivery. And I think I can number things. One is it's applicable at all levels of learning, so you can apply learning design to a specific activity right the way up to a qualification program of, a named degree or a postgraduate degree. So you can apply it across all of those things. And what it really involves is taking a design approach, which I think is kind of analogous to software design, which involves thinking about it from a user perspective, in this case, the learners, and really making those design decisions quite explicit. We've done it like this because of this. And that, I think both those things sound obvious. It's like everyone says that they are, it's become a cliche really to say that we're taking a student-centered approach, and often sort of take the mickey out of people who say that, like, as opposed to what, as opposed to a university-centered approach. But I think often actually when we designed our courses, just speaking from the Open University experience anyway, what we often started from was really from a content first approach. So we would sit down in these meetings, we work in teams to design our courses, and basically we'd have conversations that went something like, okay, we're going to have 10 printed units and 2 CD-ROMs. Let's fill them up. And that was kind of where we started from, rather than thinking like what's the best way to design this activity for these students. So I think it was kind of really trying to make us flip the way we thought about design, coming to the course design process. So the approach we took was take a number of design views to think about design from a number of different perspectives, and I'll come on to some of those later, and to give some frameworks and mechanisms to allow people across the university to share and discuss learning teaching ideas. And that, again, that might sound obvious, but often when you're in these discussions with your fellow educators, you might be coming to them from different perspectives, and even the language you use, people might have different interpretations of terms depending on their discipline and their background. So we wanted a kind of common framework and set of tools where we could kind of make a lot of these decisions explicit and discuss them. And so that involved this development of these tools to kind of help people make decisions as they went along in the course design process. So I think interesting thing about why we adopted it, and this might not be the same for why other people want to adopt it. So the kind of lofty aim was to aid the course design process by providing a set of tools that support a student activity-based approach. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. But I think in reality, it was driven by a number of different elements. We conducted a big staff survey. This was about 10 years ago, or maybe a bit longer actually, to kind of get our academics' perspective on a number of changes that are going on. And at the time, and I think this is still true, particularly in predominantly face-to-face universities, there were a lot of new technologies coming in, and people felt there were lots of new pedagogies available to them. They also felt the process of course design and specification was inconsistent across universities. So sort of things, I think we started out in 1969 with a fairly consistent approach, but as things moved on, localized changes happen and things develops. And I'm sure you have the same sort of things. Like when someone new joins university, they'll say, so why are we doing it like this? And it's like, I don't know, we've always done it like that, was kind of often the answer, you know. So I think we kind of had all these localized versions of things. It's also quite difficult to share best practice because a lot of the pedagogy became embedded within content, and you couldn't talk about your course design approach without talking about art history or physics or something. And I think people can find it quite difficult to separate those two out. So we wanted this kind of common way to talk about it. And we felt the current design focus was centered on content, going back to that point I made at the start, and delivery rather than the student experience. We kind of talked about the stuff rather than what the students were experiencing. So continuing on this staff survey, that people felt that creating a course was becoming a much more complex process, partly because of all these new technologies to integrate. And they agreed there was a need for clearer methods to represent their components and their approach. So they were confident in their belief of the ICT, computer technology, internet stuff had lots of potential for our students, but that it was being realised was they weren't so sure about that. And I think many of them felt quite overwhelmed by the challenge of all this new stuff that was coming along. You know, this was like at the end of 2010s. With all this new technology, blogs, you know, forums, synchronous tools, you know, shared whiteboards. What do we do with all this stuff? You know, it's like, and what was the best way to integrate that into their courses? And so we kind of proposed learning design as an approach to this. And so learning design supports the design process in a number of ways. So we introduced a consistent structured design specification and review process. So when you were designing your course, you would use these tools, and that would then go into the production process. So out of that process, you would say, this is what we need in order to achieve a design process. And then when you came to review your course at the end, you'd say, how did it meet our design goals? We provided a set of simple tools, which I'll talk about later. It also helped us reveal the costs and performance outcomes of design decisions. And I'll talk a bit about how we've used some analytics to look at how students are actually performing. And that, again, it might sound obvious, but often our perception of things that were useful in courses wasn't actually the truth. So, you know, academics might really love this fantastic animation they've spent a lot of money developing, getting the IT people to develop a fantastic animation, or some fantastic videos that required you to fly to Hawaii to film or something. But actually, when we review their performance, there's no correlation, for example, between whether students engage with that content and their performance in the module or something. So I think having these tools allows us to think about what were the elements that were working or weren't working within a course. Just re-emphasize that point about it kind of really gave us a student activity focus and a shared language for the team to talk about what they were doing. And we set up a kind of exemplar library that allowed people then to share their designs across the university. So if you're in the business school, you could look at what someone had done in the art school and think, okay, I can see what they're doing there without it becoming sort of embedded in their sort of disciplinary language. And support faculty teams in choosing integrating a range of media, because you're taking this student perspective. You're not thinking about, not starting from content like I want to have an animation. You're rather thinking like, I want to teach students calculus. what's the best way to do that? And that's a slight flip on how we would approach it, I think. And later on, I think it became a really useful tool for us to have the learning design tools as we've moved into other areas such as MOOCs and more recently micro-credentials. Having learning design allowed us to get into those areas and apply them. And actually, part of the reason I'm here was the first time I met Jorg was at a conference in the US talking about MOOCs, and I was talking about our learning design analysis of MOOCs as a way of thinking about them. And I should also say we actually bonded over ice hockey, nothing to do with study. There we are. So how are we doing for time? Good. I thought just one thing to kind of a fun thing to think about how design can influence a course, not to think about how we can improve it, but to start the other way. Think of 1 or 2 ways which you could really ruin an online blended course from a design perspective. What could you do that would really make it a bad experience for students? And just put it in the chat. This can be from your own experience. We're not naming names here. You know, it's a clean space, but put in a design idea that would make it an online course or a blended course just really bad for students. So, okay, yeah, good. That's right. Yeah, 1 hour recorded lectures, talking head. Yeah, been there, seen those. Only post PDFs and long video. Yeah, too many things to click. Yeah, that's yeah. I think the too many things to click is also about no highlighting which ones are the important ones. The kind of here's just a bunch of 20 things to click. No interaction, possibly interaction between students. Reteach what was in the videos. Pick one common language. Yep. Okay, that point from Fiona, but not thinking about the effort of time it would take for students to engage. I'm going to come on to that. We did exactly that with workload planning. So that's a really good one. Not answering questions from students, have no clear plan, students interact. Yeah, these are all excellent ideas. And I think what this demonstrates is, you know, by thinking of the bad examples, we demonstrate the power of design really to kind of influence how students engage with a course. So thank you for engaging in that. And it'd be worth looking back on this chat later for all of you, like what the bad ideas here. Good, thank you. So just to sort of go through our approach in a bit more depth, we've produced a number of products, if you like, tools. So the main one of these was an activity planner, which allows you to plot out what students are doing according to the number of categories. And I'll go on to that. We developed a range of activities of ways you can use different things and sort of fun activities, that often face-to-face in little groups, and a number of different tools. So I'll show you some of these at the end. But for example, one of my favorite tools was just a pack of cards that had on it a number of different words belong to different kind of categories. So there might be things like relating to pedagogy, we're going to be problem-based or constructivist or whatever. And then there was kind of just general terms like innovative, fun, you know, hard. And then there was things about the technologies you might use. And we just gave this pack, I think it was like 40 odd cards, to teams. We said to them, like, pick your top 10 or whatever that you think are the priorities for your course, and then justify it. And often everyone in that course team who thought they were all on board and all understood what the course is about would pick a completely different top 10. And it really helped surface a lot of interesting discussion. Like, I remember I've been in one and someone had put innovative at the top. And it was going like, that course isn't innovative at all. We're really boring. We're doing really traditional stuff. So I think I give that as an example. It's not a particularly sophisticated tool, but actually the process we put around it and the activity we put around it really helped surface lots of hidden assumptions within those course teams. So we produced a paper pack of all these things, just partly because we've moved to online ones now, we've got software tools, but the paper pack was actually really useful at the start, just to get people in a group, something actually really powerful, but sitting around a table, scribbling on a big sheet with these big kind of A3 sheets of paper, like, we'll put this there and we'll have this activity there and stuff. I think just getting people to engage with that kind of stuff was really useful. The exemplar library to share things between faculties. And we also set up, there's some boring stuff you have to do as well, kind of staff support process. So we had staff in a central learning design team who could run workshops, but also that staff could be brought out. So we had learning design champions within each of the faculties and those kind of things. And those things can actually be the reason why these initiatives succeed or fail, much more than actually what's involved with them, the kind of quality of the material. So we did this stuff early on, and we've carried on doing it. It's been changing it. Generally, the feedback was positive, although I'll come on to less positive feedback at the end. But I think just people picking out, the benefit for them, it's been really positive. It helped them get involved with the module. And I think we have people come from different roles. Some people are more admin, some people are more technical, some people are subject experts, and having a common language allowed them to talk, and share their experience. And people talking about the kind of benefits of the second one from the bottom. I think it's interesting. There's benefits both pedagogically and financially. So it's not just a nice to have in a way. It does have kind of real benefits to the institution, and it helps improve the student experience. So we had a number of principles we kind of wanted to go through and fall to these things. First was it had to be pedagogy neutral. We weren't come along saying this is the pedagogy. We've decided that a problem-based approach is the best way to go, and that's what you've got to do, because our tools had to work across all the disciplines, all the faculties, and people have very strong beliefs about what's best for their faculty, their subject area. And it wasn't really our role to say this is the best way to design a course. Rather, we were giving them tools to kind of help support that process. Start with student activity, integrate into standard practice. Again, quite a boring thing that I spent so many meetings in. We've got this thing called the stage gate review. If you want to develop a new course, it has to go through this review process, and getting learning design implemented as a stage in the stage gate review. So you've undertaken a learning design session, thought about that, was kind of one of those things that it's really boring. It requires lots of work. Once it's there, it then becomes standard practice across the university. It's really instrumental in making that work. We wanted it to kind of encourage innovation and creativity. So we didn't want it to kind of just be a box ticking exercise or something. People, oh God, we've got to do the learning design session. Actually, it's kind of often where lots of fun takes place to kind of make sure we were still allowing that for academics. And to facilitate the production process. It wasn't just something you did, then you went away and did the production process separately. It kind of fed into that, and there was a direct link. So the standard framework allows sharing of the practice, a conduit for other teaching-related projects, a quality audits. At the end, we could review where we were and do the kind of annual review of the whole course. I think I've covered that previously. So I mentioned we had an activity planner, and this work builds on the work of Gráinne Knoll, I think, who's in your reading list. Gráinne used to work at the university with me, and she led a lot of this early work. I sort of came in afterwards. And what we did was we split what students do up into 6 categories plus assessment. And so this is very roughly us saying, when we design an activity, what is it we think students are doing in that activity? So the 6 categories are summatives, that's reading, watching, listening, sort of taking in information, finding and handling information, that's sort of doing something with that information. So the right-hand side of this table are the types of verbs you might be using if you were describing the activity. So, collate, plot, find, discover, those kind of things. Communications, this might take place in student forums. We'd ask them to discuss something, share, report, collaborate. Productive is where they're making something. It might be writing a blog post or taking a photograph, constructing something. Experiential, this was particularly applicable on certain types of courses we run that are more vocational. So we'd have nurse training, for example. We might be asking students to draw on their own daily practice. Interactive and adapted, this might be working with simulations, those kind of things, sort of trialing stuff, experimenting, particularly with STEM courses. And we had a bit of a to and fro with academics in this. We didn't want to include assessment as a separate category because we thought it was covered by the previous ones. But the feedback from academic colleagues was it needs to be a separate category, so we're putting other things into it. So we've got assessment as a kind of, and that's formal or informal assessment. So then what you might end up with is some kind of basic chart like this. So imagine you're on the left-hand side, you've got either the topic you're discussing, a particular session, or that week's work. And then you might categorize how many hours are people spending in each of those categories that we're getting them to think about. And from this, we can draw nice bar charts. And that these were some mapping of existing courses. One of the things they allowed us to do then was to go back on existing courses and get people to map them against these categories. And that was a really useful process as well, because we would then show them back to the course teams who developed them, and they'd go, blimey, I didn't realize there was so much assimilative. I thought we'd been really varied in what we'd done. There'd be like 80% assimilative. So it really made them reflect on their own kind of course production that they'd done. And that these are by no means kind of standard, typical, but just to kind of demonstrate across 3 different courses from these areas the different range of things you might have. So in general science, for example, there's more experiential, people doing more kind of experiments, those kind of things. And in Spanish, more productive, people producing things. And I think sometimes it's not always clear where people place things within these. So like, I think the Spanish one's quite interesting. So obviously they've decided lots of things they're doing, they've placed under productive, whereas, you might think off the top of your head, surely there'd be lots of communication in there. So I think it depends how they're classifying those things. So I just want to think about some specific examples of where we've used learning design beyond that kind of basic course design approach to then think about student problems we've had or student issues. Once you've kind of got this foundation of a learning design framework in place, it becomes a tool with which you can address many other things. So we've used it to think about how do we address retention, making sure we keep students on courses and they progress onto other courses. How do we think about workload, student workload? How do we think about use of new media, like how do we integrate social media into a course, or open educational inclusion program at the university, and having learning design allows us a much more inclusive. Think about things such as students as creators, frameworks you might want to implement. Having learning design already in place gives you a tool with which you can implement those. And we've done quite a lot is work with the analytics team, whether it's or looking at specific survey questions, those kind of things, or how students engage. Find data and combine it with the student satisfaction and performance data to look at specific issues. Understanding of the student learning behaviour, to interpret against what you wanted them, how that design is working, what you wanted to do, and then that feeds into the analytics to student work. Be problematic, the key that people do see studying online. And I think it's clear with the online people will add more, and they haven't, and I'm sure they're getting much more than they used to, and all these bits aren't really being mapped against each other. So we were worried about workload, and so what we did was we did a workload mapping of our tools to see what the student workload was like in those. And then we estimate the times per activity to calculate workload. So we came up with some things like if you're giving them stuff to read, then we estimate the number of words per minute someone will be reading. If it's so a kind of breakdown might be like this. So you've got all the different items down the side, all the activities, word counts, figures, how long we think they're going to take to do it, and then further along those things. And from that, you can get a total of how many hours per week they're going to be working on that. So this is our online tool for that activity mapper I mentioned. So we've got the categories, the 6 categories plus assessment along there. So this is how long the students are spending per week. And then from that, we come existing courses. So you can see there's quite a high variation of those things. This was a kind of, you could then map it across the weeks. So there's quite a high variation in what we're expecting students to do. And so these were the 11 courses, that's their course codes. So not only was there high variation within courses, there's also quite a high variation between courses. So if you were expected to do, it might vary quite a lot. And these were all at level 1, so that's our first level undergraduate level. Then they did some analysis and also our student survey data. So question 35 was how capable, and you can see a pretty strong correlation between they can keep up with this stuff going out. Rates, so the more stuff you give students, the more likely they are to drop out. And this is workload distribution. So I think it's not just the amount you give them, but it's also that variation between weeks that's really important for students. So if one week you're doing 4 hours and the next week you're doing 10 hours, like the average may be okay, but actually that variation is really difficult for students to plan and accommodate in their time. This is about the kind of distribution of that workload. So here's an example of poor distribution. See week 1, 9.6, it goes down to 4.72 in week 6, up to 10.9 in week 9. So for students, that's really hard to fix into their lifestyle and wonder what they're doing. And here's a kind of much more balance. You're never going to have exactly all the way through. And what this did was then allow us to kind of, we fed this back to the module team and they could then take action. So they could inform, we have part-time tutors who support the students. They can inform these tutors about the distribution of workload. So at least warning students, say, hey, look, week 6 is going to be a heavy week. We've got a lot to get through. That make sure you're planning extra time for week 6. And even that can really help, I think. So send these simple messages from the course team and from the tutors, and they then redesigned their course to move some of that workload around to help reduce it and make it more even. Sorry, this is just another fancy diagram that iterates the earlier point about the kind of integration between data and design, and about understanding what students are doing, trying to give them a kind of more consistent experience. Another thing we did, so I worked on this project, was I was quite interested in what we could do about designing for student retention. So whether, particularly with students studying part-time, we have a higher dropout rate than most face-to-face campus universities, and that's for a number of reasons. First of all, we don't have these entry requirements, so we often get students who aren't really prepared for academic study, or decide it isn't for them, or whatever. And also, if they're working part-time at home, other things can often impact on their lives a lot more. They might have a change in job or something, they're not studying full-time at a campus. But I think also, so there are a number of things that can affect student retention, which are beyond your control in many ways. But also there are things in our design that can influence whether we keep students or not. So making them feel welcome, overloading them with too much work, as we've just seen, can impact upon it. Giving them lots of complex tasks one after another, so they don't feel like they're ever getting anywhere, those kind of things. So I wanted to kind of see what we could do in the design stage to help improve student retention. So we sort of undertook a number of different activities. We looked at what was going on internally. Lots of people doing research on retention for individual modules, but not kind of across the piece. We looked at external literature about what was useful for student retention. We interviewed a number of course teams and said to them, what your experiences on student retention, how have you designed for it. SEAM is our student survey, so we looked at some of the comments that students had made there, particularly from students who had dropped out and not completed, and what was their reason for withdrawing from a course. And we compared the data relating to high and low retention modules. So kind of tried to cover all our bases about why do students drop out, particularly with our study. And from this, we found a number of findings. So I won't go through all these. The external and internal literature gave some emphasis on workload and assessment design, I think, which we knew, but at least gave us some focus for that. I think from the module team chairs, they often felt, to get engagement with students was often highly rated, and I think that's something we'll come to with thinking about the online pivot. Lots of people said it's really difficult to engage students online. I think that's particularly true with online lectures, if you're just giving straightforward online lectures. So module team chairs often about how they try to make stuff engaging for students, to make them feel they were doing something, not just passively receiving stuff. Students in their own comments said they felt fed up with stuff, felt out of date, or dated material. And again, engaging materials came up quite strongly. So from this, we kind of took away a number of interesting factors. For instance, there's quite a lot of research in external literature that says students who make social connections are often much more likely to carry on with their studies and not drop out. So giving students some ways to make those social connections when they haven't got a cafe or a bar to hang out in a distance is important. And from this, we developed what we handily called the iceberg model, which has these 7 factors. So good design for retention should be integrated, collaborative, engaging, balanced, economical, reflective, and gradual. I'll just cover each of those. And we developed then on those 7 tips, 10 retention tips. So, and again, all these things seem obvious, but I think sometimes it's just worth making them explicit and asking people to reflect, does your course do this? You should try and do this. So one was engage students early on in the module and make sure those first few weeks of study draw people in. It's a kind of, it's an old trick, like the first paragraph of the book or the opening sequence of the film used to hook people in and make think this is great, and then they might stay with the more boring parts, but don't start off with the really boring parts. It's like you kind of hook people in. Look for potential retention black spots and address these as far as possible. So I think this was like almost knowing that you've got some slippery road coming up. In week 6, we're going to be doing an online collaborative activity. Lots of students find this really hard. It's really useful though. You have to do it, stick with it, but just preparing them for it, and so it doesn't come as a surprise and they get fed up and drop out. So monitor that workload during production, as we've mentioned on the previous study we've done, and then make sure we do a final check before we head over to production. LTS is our production people. Make sure materials are easy to access. The one thing that really gets on students' nerves is, like, I think someone putting loads of links up, or go and look at this and you click on the link and it doesn't work, or it keeps, it's like they don't want to spend, if they've allocated 2 hours of study of an evening, they don't want to spend an hour of that trying to get something to work that should just work. That's incredibly frustrating for students. Break modules up into shorter chunks. And so I think that's kind of, it's a slightly behaviorist approach, but it can just help students feel some rewards. Like, okay, I'm sitting down at week 1, and obviously there was assessment along the way, but just helping students feel that after 4 weeks they've got somewhere, like, now we've completed this, well done, it's like, and just getting some sense of achievement. Even for some modules, not all, but some explored the idea of digital badges, like, hooray, you've completed this bit, here's a digital badge, with some kind of reward for where you are in your course. And not just feel like it's a big long marathon slog to week 30 or whatever. So build in sufficient opportunities for self-assessment and formative assessment. It's particularly important for distance students. Distance students often, because they're not chatting as much to each other, they often don't know how well they're doing. Like, they've got no idea, like, am I the same as everyone else? Am I struggling? It's like, I don't know, I need to compare. And I think we see that a lot with now that students have switched to online in many conventional universities. Make assessment relevant, interesting, challenging, and perhaps even fun. There's an idea. But I think, we place so much on assessment, but often it can feel quite irrelevant. Do this task just because we've asked you to, and people are like, why have I got to do this? It's like, what? It doesn't seem to have any relevance to what I want to do. So make it feel relevant to students. An obvious one, make sure the study plan is broken up on a week-by-week basis. If we didn't always do this, we might give them like 3 or 4 week chunks. That can feel like a real slog to get through. Like, if it's week by week, you kind of feel like you get, sorry, I've got to do this for this week, and I'm on to next week. That's fine. Build these sort of different skills in, study vision assessment skills throughout the modules. Like, people are developing the skills as they go along, but very explicitly construct those, not just think they're going to arise sort of secondhand. And build in sufficient reflection and vision time, which I think is fairly standard practice. But often I think when you're trying to cram everything into a module, it's like, we must cover this, we must cover this. You've got this big bunch of content you're trying to push in, and to allow kind of self-study time or reflection time seems like a waste of real estate, as it were, I think, in your course study time. But it's really important for students.
Martin, it's a question from Fiona about how contextual these design considerations are, or you think there are, how universal are or contextual?
Yeah, it's a good question, Fiona. I think we try to make them fairly universal. And I think some of it will depend on if you're face-to-face, for example, then some of those things might be done already. But I think there are those sort of principles and those design tips are pretty universal. I mean, some might apply more to you than others. Some of you may say, well, we do this already, or of course we don't need to worry about that. But I think they're worth bearing in mind for nearly every course, just particularly if you're worried about retention. If you've got 100% retention, fine, don't worry about it. But if you're worried about retention on a course, I think it's worth reviewing from the perspective of this. I think I gave a paper for this. There's a resource on this, a publication that goes into more detail about the model, so you can have a look at that there. Yeah, sorry, I haven't got the chat open while I'm presenting, so I won't see any questions come up. But that's fine to just interrupt. Thanks. So here's just some tools that you can download and play with. One thing we use quite a lot very early on in the process is this idea of personas. I'm sure many of you might have used this. The idea of personas is to be really specific. So you think of a student, not necessarily the typical student. If you don't want to get caught up in stereotypes we study, you think of a student who may be studying your course, and you do this in a number of groups. So the idea, you should try and be very specific, give them a name, what they're studying, how old they are, what the first language is, what level of study they've got, and all these boxes here. And think, what's their situation? How are they living? Like, have they got a dedicated study room? You know, are they carers for people? What are their study motivations? Why are they studying? Do they want to? Is it to get a job? Is it for personal interest or whatever? Where they've come from, and I think these just help you. And we often then call back to these personas as we're going through study. Like, you know, what would so and so think of the course we're developing now? This part wouldn't be very relevant to them, or something. So I think there's kind of just useful to have a range of these to make the course you're designing feel real to people. So I've put the URL in at the bottom of these, but I think all the slides are available, so don't worry about having to write them down. So all these are available on our website, the OU. So this is just a version of the activity planner, so you can break it down by weeks or topics. So if you want, think about the learning outcomes you set and the assessment that you're going to, how it relates to assessment that week, and then the 6 categories and how much you're going to spend for each time in those as you design the course. And we've also got one at a kind of more specific activity level. So if you're thinking about, I want to do one particular activity, whether it's a group activity, for example, you know, that just really prompts you to ask a number of questions about that activity and how you're designing it. I think some of my favorite tools are these cards. So we developed a number of cards for 3 different areas: academic skills, digital information literacy, and employability. So these are things you might want to be embedding within your course throughout. And we've got them at our 3 undergraduate levels and at postgraduate level. And then we developed a number of activities that go around them. So you might ask again, you know, it's like, what are the top 10 academic skills we're developing in this module? You know, pick your cards out. Or when we've got our activity planner, map the academic skills against those kind of things, or just kind of discuss them in groups as you think are important. So I think, again, these are quite good activities to use in groups if you're doing a module design in teams. And again, they're all downloadable, Creative Commons. And then we've got a number of resources online that you can use and guides. So taking a design approach to each of these elements, kind of how to design collaborative activities, how to embed employability, the retention work that I've mentioned, how to think about design an inclusive curriculum, and making your content more active, how to engage in active learning. So again, there's some good advice and tips there. And then lastly, I just thought there were some areas you might want to discuss or consider, just based on my experience anyway. It wasn't all plain sailing. I won't say everyone welcomed us with open arms and we came along saying we're going to do learning design for you. And it was a long slog. I mean, 10 more years to kind of get learning design implemented. You know, academic change doesn't happen quickly often. So academics often said to us, "Oh, I don't want to engage with learning design. It's going to restrict innovation. You can't tell me what to do." So I think that was kind of really important then to stress how that's kind of pedagogic neutral approach. We're not here to tell you how to design the courses, but rather to give you tools to help you design the courses. But nevertheless, there was that kind of pushback sometimes that you're restricting my innovation. You know, I feel for educators on one myself, and here's another initiative for you to engage with the Open University. Here's another set of forms that management want you to complete. So I think that that's always an issue. So that goes back to that point about trying to make it fun and engaging and worthwhile for academics. Every topic and discipline thinks that they're special, so that's something you have to just accept. Like, so we would go along with those 6 categories of like simulative, information handling, and the mathematicians would say, "Oh, they don't suit my topic," and the art history people say, "Oh, they don't suit my topic," but actually they do. It's like, so when you sit down with them and talk about it, say, "Well, actually that could be interpreted like that, couldn't they?" Okay, yes. Yeah. And what you don't want to do is end up with, you know, specific categories for every different discipline. That completely destroys the whole aim of learning design to be a kind of universal framework that you understand. And I think perhaps the most common one was, you know, don't you come here telling me how to design my courses. I had one session I was running where I was leading on learning design and trying to get a particular school to engage with it. I was probably lucky to escape with my life. There was such kind of resistance and pushback on it, you know. But interestingly enough, about a year later, they came back to us and said, our course on X, I won't reveal which faculty it was, is really struggling, and students are really unhappy and we're losing them. You know, that learning design stuff, could you come in and run a session for us on how to do that? So that's what I mean. You have to play the long game slightly with this. I thought lastly, just consider how it relates to the online pivot. So, you know, everyone's suddenly shifting to online or blended learning. I think one of the things that we often don't appreciate in a physical face-to-face university is that the physical architecture does a lot of work for us. It's like, so you turn up to a certain place to have a lecture, that's your content, and it tells you how, it even suggests what pedagogy you'll be getting, which is mainly assimilative. You'll be listening to the person. Then you go to a different place to kind of do communication work, the seminar room, and again, the structure there of sitting around in a circle, again, suggests what you're going to be doing. The students might then go to a different place, the cafe or the bar, to do social interaction. And when you move online, all of those cues disappear. So you have to build them in explicitly into your work. And this is where learning design comes in. And that's a real strain, I think, for both educators and students, because equally there's also quite a bit of the burden shifts onto students that, you know, you previously, you don't really have to organize your time that much. It's like, turn up for lecture X in room B and I'm done, kind of thing, go here, do these things. Whereas particularly if you move to a much more asynchronous model, then a lot of that responsibility for organization falls on the students. I think there's a kind of really, so learning design is a means to kind of help bridge that gap, I think, and do that shift and build those things explicitly. There's a lot around cost and resource issues, I think, with online pivot. So, you know, I mentioned the Open University is purely distance based. So we've developed a model that works for that, with kind of multidisciplinary teams that develop courses. And our courses can take like 2 years to produce, not always, but they can take 2 years to produce with a big team, and they then run for 8 years with lots of students on them. And so that's one financial model. Whereas a campus-based university might have, you know, a face-to-face series of seminars that don't take very long to produce. It's just a single academic producing their course materials that might only run for 20, 30 students. So it's a different set of economics, I think. And I think part of the problem many institutions are going to face now is they're kind of caught between both of those modes. Increasingly, students want some of the flexibility of online, that they quite enjoyed being able to access their lectures online and having more online resources and some of that flexibility. Equally, they like the face-to-face as well, and they enjoyed that bit. And those two things operate on quite different financial models. And this kind of, whether it's you're working with a team or whether it's an individual academic. And so I think the way to think about learning design is there are probably different levels which you can use it. You can use kind of learning design light, which might just be, I'm going to think about my course design as an individual academic, and perhaps use that activity planner at a very kind of macro level. But then you might kind of go down to much more kind of team-based focused effort. So I think learning design is one way we can start bridging that gap from where universities are now to where they might want to be in 5-10 years time. And I think one of the things the online pivot has done is really moved online learning kind of center stage, and it's sort of given it boosters, if you like. I think whereas lots of universities were thinking about moving in this space, now they kind of know they have to, and it's made them speed up that process. But it's not easy to get from where they think they might want to be, a lovely blended solution, taking advantage of the best things of online and face-to-face, and where they are currently in the financial models they have. And learning design isn't the only tool in the armory to do that, but I think it is at least one method for helping you do that. There, I'm going to end there because I thought we might have some time for discussion. So that's me done. I hope that made some sense. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm going to give a couple of minutes to open up the floor for any questions that anyone may have. You can either post your question in the chat, which might be the best place. Are there any questions from anyone else?
I think Fiona had another question about long it takes to design a module or a program in advance, and how often it's reviewed?
Yeah, so this goes back to the good question, Fiona. It goes back to the financing. So I said it can take up to 2 years. We're trying to do that quicker, and so some courses are a lot quicker. And they typically have a first year review. So after the first year presentation, there'll be a student survey analysis that they're going to get so much more intense review then. And then there might be some changes made. And then there's often a midlife review. So after 4 years, see that stuff is still relevant. And then an end of course review after 8 years. And when it may be decided to renew it and to carry on. So yeah, that's a particular set of economics. We used to talk about, we spend a lot on production, but then once it goes, it's almost like a Fordist model of economics. So we spend a lot on production, but then it can roll out the same course every year for 8 years. And I think we face some of this sort of dilemma when we moved online, because suddenly you can change the course all the time, and that it meant presentation wasn't as cheap as it used to be. You kind of need to keep more academics involved in doing that. So I think we've faced a similar tension the other way around in a way.
Is another question. Any advice to universities that are slow to adopt these type of strategies?
I think look at consider your students. A lot of this isn't just nice to have. Look at us. I think I'm going on my daughter's experience, but like I keep saying, oh God, they need to do some learning design. I think just continually throwing stuff at students isn't helpful, and I think a lot of the frustration students are feeling are down to poor design at the moment. And I understand, I think when the online pivot came, people had to sort of put their course online in 2 weeks. It was always going to be an emergency solution, and I think that's completely understandable. But I think now we're in this shift. It's like things are really going to change in this space, and universities are going to be competing. I think I've said that. I think first of all, we might well see a backlash against online, and people go, "Hey, look, we always knew face-to-face was best. Let's forget that online stuff." And I think we might see some of that, and you're already seeing some of that, I think, in the media. But I think good universities will now say, okay, there are advantages here. We've had a taste for some of it. We need to work out how to integrate that. And so I think just in terms of competition, to ignore this opportunity in a way to take advantage of this sort of boost to online learning would be a mistake, I think, strategically.
Thanks, Martin. Jörg, your hand's up.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, for excellent presentation. Really, really nice to hear from you firsthand about your work at OU. Just for understanding and comparison to for the general concept of learning design, in particular amongst educational developers in Sweden, another workshop format I think is contemporary, pretty known, and I just want to see if I understand this correctly. I don't know if you're familiar with the ABC Learning Design workshop from UCL. Yeah. Is this something? It's very similar, or as I understand it, or is there? If you're familiar with it, Martin, is there? What would be the main differences?
I'm not sure. I don't think I know it well enough to talk about that, but I think I know they run a similar approach. In some ways, I think it doesn't matter what learning design approach you choose, just choose a learning design approach. So, and I said, actually, I think a lot of the benefits from this was the discussions that it surfaced for course teams and educators and admin staff. And I think just having a common language is the really important part. So we went with those 6 categories, but maybe it's 4 categories, maybe it's 10 categories. I don't think it really matters in some ways. I think what matters is to have a common framework that you can work with, and just prompt people to think about this student activity approach up front. So I'm not going to say this is better than this. I don't know. I'm sure that I think they've all come from similar places, actually.
It's another question also about what pedagogies you find most used when applying learning design?
Yeah, and as the comment says, I did stress it's pedagogy neutral. So I don't think any particular pedagogy comes out and say it's used across all the disciplines. So it does vary. But one interesting thing that happened was I mentioned we mapped existing courses. And I think people were often quite shocked at how much assimilative they had. And they thought they were doing different things, like we'll give them a video, we'll give them a podcast, we'll give them reading. But actually all of that, even though it's different media, it's still the same sort of cognitive activity. It's still just taking information in. And so what we do see is as people use the tools, either to reflect on existing modules or design from scratch, there's sort of a thing at the back of your mind that says, like, I want an even distribution across those categories. That seems fair. I don't want one big pile. So I think what it does do, just almost implicitly by having those bar charts, is make people move away from a very just assimilative approach, which perhaps dominated before, so to a more kind of activity-based approach.
Thanks very much, Martin. Our time is almost up, and Martin, it's been a fabulous hour. Great listening to you. Thank you for sharing. For me, one of the key messages that you reiterated was it's looking at what the students do. It's looking at the learning activities. It places a full emphasis on what the students do as they journey through the module. So thank you for that. On that note, I'm going to post a statement in. It would be lovely if you could share in the chat what best practice in learning design shared by Martin in this webinar that you will take away with you in particular. So if you don't mind responding to that in you disappear, if you could just respond very briefly to that in the chat, that would be great. Martin, also thank you very much for the wealth of resources that you shared with us. The open learning, the Open University Learning Design resources, that blog with a wealth of templates and documents and resources that you shared. Thank you very much for that. On that note, Lars, I'm not sure if there are any final comments from you.
Really, just great thanks to Martin to share from your experience and how you've been working. I think it gives a lot of thought and inspiration, I think, into digging into learning design also a little bit more with the pedagogies in this topic. Hopefully you will join the tweet chat next week. We have also with Martin involved, where we can follow up with that short communication media Twitter chat, follow up questions from this topic.